What a fantastic turnout today. My name is Polly Gardner, and I'm a fellow with the Critical Qualitative Health Research Center, and also a continuing education coordinator for CQ. Before we get started here today, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. And I'd like us to begin to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all of the lands that we're on today. And while we meet on this virtual platform, it's also important to acknowledge that we're all living on ancestral lands and unceded territories of Indigenous people across the country and around the world. We make this acknowledgement to show our gratitude and to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improve our relationships between our nations, and also to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous people and their cultures. So the plan for today is that we'll start with some brief introductions, and then Amaya will do a presentation for approximately 45 minutes. And then we'll open it up for question and also discussion. Just a note, the session is being recorded. You heard that. During the presentation, we ask that everyone please mute themselves and also to shut off their videos. We will not be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation, but we will use it, the chat feature and the hand raising tool after the presentation for the Q&A and discussion. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel Grace, who is also a CQ fellow, and to do the introductions for our presentation today.
Thanks so much, Polly, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Amaya Perez-Brumer this afternoon. Amaya is a Latinx critical global health scholar, and in 2019 joined us at the Dal Lana School of Public Health as an assistant professor in the Division of Social and Behavioral Health Science. She earned her PhD in socio-medical sciences and sociology from Columbia University, and holds an MSc in Social and Behavioral Sciences from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Her scholarship integrates social science theory with innovative mixed methodological approaches to improve HIV prevention intervention implementation and acceptability among people of diverse genders and sexualities globally. She has an incredibly impressive CV, has published 2 edited books and more than 70 peer-reviewed articles. She's currently the principal investigator of a SSHRC Insight Development Award and a SSHRC Partnership Engage Award, developing social justice-informed global health strategies for gender and sexual minority communities in Peru. Her current book project, The Global Science and Business of Gender and Sexual Diversity in the New Era of HIV, examines the political economy of large-scale HIV biomedical prevention research, largely designed in the global north, but conducted in the global south. The talk today delves into an aspect of her current project and is entitled Ethnography of Data Politics, Rethinking Risk, Value, and Justice in HIV Prevention Science. This talk is based on a chapter that is the recipient of the 2021 AIDS and Anthropology Research Group of the Society for Medical Anthropology Clark Taylor Professional Paper Award. That was a mouthful. Just to say, we're really thrilled that she's presenting this work, which was recently awarded this prestigious honor. I also know Amaya to be a really dedicated mentor and colleague, and I'm thrilled that she's a part of this intellectual community to push some of our methodological work. And now it's my absolute pleasure to turn the virtual floor over to Amaya.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Polly. Thank you all for being here. I'm thrilled to share the next hour and a half with you. So let's do a little screen share. Okay. I believe you are seeing a PDF of my PowerPoint, right?
Yes, we got you.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, so hello and thank you all for attending today. I'm honored to join this community as a CQ fellow, and it is a treat to be able to share my work with you today. My name is Amaya Perez-Brummer, and I'm a critical global health scholar trained in both public health and sociology, and now an assistant professor at DLSPH. Today, we are going to explore the complexity of data, its social relations, how to leverage methods that visibilize the embedded relationality, and explore why it is critical to understand the social lives of data to attend to the power and politics in global health. Importantly, as we in public health know all too well, what counts is what is counted. Very grateful for Polly, who did a very beautiful land acknowledgement, so we will skip this. So to start, I'm going to take a few moments to introduce myself. The notion of reflexivity guides both who I am as a scholar and the work that I conduct. By reflexivity, I mean the recognition that my background, perspective, and position shapes how I do research and the questions that I ask. I want to share with you some of my background to be explicit about how it might inform my research interests. I am Venezuelan, American, and now after 5 years in Toronto, a Canadian permanent resident. Spanish is my first language, and I identify as Latina. My master's training was in social epidemiology with an emphasis in clinical trial design and implementation. Yet my doctoral training in both health sciences and sociology has allowed me to pivot from making and analyzing of data to the analyzing of making data. At the heart of my queries is the tension between the work needed to achieve measurable impacts of and for HIV science and the politics of doing so. This has set me on a course to take up critical social sciences, namely feminist approaches to science and technology studies, critical data studies, and a turn towards collective approaches to health and well-being that foregrounds power, and namely traditions rooted in Latin American social medicine, such as epidemiology without numbers. I ask you to be patient with me as I'm still playing with my identity as an academic. Broadly, my work examines the political economy of knowledge production in global health. For now, I self-identify as an ethnographic epidemiologist to underscore and unsettle what some may perceive to be a fundamental paradox in my scholarship. On the one hand, I am an epidemiologist in that I quantitatively study how diseases occur in different groups of people and why. Under this stream, I lead HIV prevention interventions, which aim to build evidence via health data on therapeutic strategies to stop HIV transmission. On the other, I'm an ethnographer of the social relations that create and give power to data within local research teams and across HIV prevention science. I locate myself in conversation with, but apart from, social epidemiologists such as Ichiro Kawachi, Greta Bauer, etc., those who study what they might term to be the social and political determinants of health. And also, while wildly fascinated by the work of critical and reflexive epidemiologists such as Ryan Pettigrew, Zinzi Bailey, Jaime Breo, who name and speak to injustices caused by neoliberal economics, importantly, my work is not in opposition, but a parallel stream. I leverage critical qualitative methods to assess data as my object of study. As such, I'm deeply interested in what Sabina Leonelli has termed data journeys to assess the relational and historicized understanding of data as lineages. It reflects on the methodological and conceptual challenges involved in the mapping, analyzing, and comparing across the production, the movements and usage of these data within and across research fields, and the strategies developed to cope with data difficulties. In doing so, my thinking is deeply indebted to scholarship that advances understandings of data and data practices as constituted in power. Most importantly, the power to shape what is knowable. Most recently, and as related to ethnographies of data politics, which is the subject of today's talk, I am influenced by the work of many. To name and to show a few, the work of Ian Hacking on making people up, Michelle Murphy and Susan Erickson on calculations and standardization processes that make life possible have pushed me to reflect on who is deemed at risk for HIV and how metrics and risk-based calculations facilitate access to needed and exceedingly costly prevention strategies. At the same time, as I increasingly think about, wow, like how the hell did we end up here? I am pushed to reject the assumed novelty of data processes. Both proponents and critics of datafication challenge technological determinism and assumptions that these instances of data power are so fundamentally different than those that have come before. So again, returning to Leonelli's idea of a data journey and the relational and historicized understanding of data as lineages, I continue to draw on and learn from concepts such as Antonia Walford's data aesthetics, Nick Caldry's data colonialism, concepts of data violence as painfully and beautifully articulated by Mbembe's necropolitics, Simone Brown's dark matters, Luis Avila's numerical torture, and others. As you can see, this literature is vast and growing, importantly rupturing disciplinary boundaries. My work in HIV is particularly indebted to Cal Byrick, who advances understandings of the ways in which data are cooked, and Robert Lorway's evidentiary sovereignty, which speaks to governance and representation through data in global health. So now on to the how. As I was tasked, I want to be explicit. I want to explicitly recognize that interest in critical methods, specifically critical qualitative methods in the health sciences, are what unite us here today and in the CQ space. I am interested in ethnography as a critical qualitative approach developed through my own personal struggle to unite my interest dabbling in reflexive epidemiology and critical ethnographic approaches, for which I've had varying degrees of successes depending on the different streams my research has taken. But to study data, I have been particularly captivated by Neomar de Almeida Felo's work on epidemiology without numbers, which draws attention to the often invisible socio-cultural politics of vital statistics measurement and calculation. In doing so, he calls for epidemiology to be more than numbers. Yet I am not sure, and I would be very keen to engage in this discussion of whether or not epidemiology beyond numbers constitutes as a critical qualitative approach and or perhaps something else. For example, as noted by Mauricio Barreto, this approach pushes us to think disciplinary beyond disciplinary domains. And he calls for a hybrid epidemiologist epistemologies to underscore the powerful ways that knowing, hence epistemic power and epistemic injustices, that come from what is counted. It is not just using methods, but deeply questioning the social political context of these methods and the power of the knowledge that is produced. I have chosen two photos to illustrate this. One, on the one hand, the very practical ways of doing ethnographic work, which involves diverse methodological toolkits, such as utilizing observations, interviews, documents, etc. On the left is a photo of me and a dear friend and colleague, Leila Huerta. Here, Leila and I have just finished doing some data collection in Lima, Peru. The photo on the right documents the ongoing struggles of activists to demand a gender identity law in Peru. This photo is meant to underscore social political context, to repoliticize the importance of reflexivity and to stress the interactive aspects of the doing of ethnographic work. To this point, I'm inspired by Quetzil Castañeda and Stacy Pigg's work that rejects the idea that ethnography is simply a methodological tool for gathering qualitative data. In this rethinking, it invites us to take up ethnography as a hybrid activity that melds the here and the now with interpersonal interaction with the emergence of associated representations. Ethnography reproduces knowledge and produces knowledge, both for the researcher and the research subjects, on the spot, in the doing of the sitting, according to Pig, through the doubling and folding back on the everyday that occurs. So up to this point, we have covered three things. The first, me and my social location. Two, some emerging literature on the importance of the why data question. And three, the how of ethnography informed by solidarity, collective health, and with a keen attention to data power and politics. So now let's get to the heart of the talk, which is the doing, and most importantly, what is to be learned. The fourth decade of HIV and AIDS has ushered in a new era of how scientific research is conducted, the technologies at play, among whom, and with an explicit focus on prevention. The advent of pre-exposure prophylaxis is a remarkable innovation to prevent HIV acquisition. Yet, this has also led to a boom in research among people considered most at risk for HIV and thus most in need of PrEP, and people classified as MSM and trans women, men who have sex with men, and trans women as central to this focus. The shift to prevention necessitates a rethinking of the value of risk data extracted from people of diverse genders and sexualities in the pursuit of HIV prevention. My work focuses on Peru, a known hotspot for HIV research among people classified as men who have sex with men and trans women. Peru has been primed historically to be a top offshore research site it is today. In part, this is due to the advent of the IPREX study conducted between 2007 and 2011, short for its Spanish name, Iniciativa Profilaxis Preexposición, which shifted the scope of possibility for Peru and propelled the field into a whole nother level. IPREX proved to be a global watershed moment for HIV prevention research and heralded a new era of PrEP science, sparking significant changes in both policy and scientific actions. Notably, the majority of IPREX global sample came from Peru. IPREX was only conducted with people categorized as MSM, a scientific category that at that time included transgender women. IPREX not only ushered in a new era of PrEP as the leading HIV prevention tool, but also an intensified focus on people of diverse genders and sexualities as the prevention population at heightened risk for HIV. Yet while Peru has been central to the testing of HIV strategies, evidence continues to reflect a burden of HIV among the very communities that participated and supported in the advancement of scientific knowledge. Available convenience samples reported that HIV prevalence is estimated to be around 15% for MSM and almost double that, close to 30% for those categorized, classified, and enumerated as transgender women. Available and emerging variations of PrEP research, including and beyond IPREX, represent an enormous profit incentive for academic researchers like myself, who are paid to carry out the research with public funds and big pharma alike. These commercial interests highlight questions around research practices that may perpetuate existing inequalities. So today more than ever, we need to be vigilant about the incorporation of economics logic into HIV prevention research to push for more equitable regulation. Precisely because of the expanding value of data derived from queer bodies in the pursuit of HIV science, my interest is in understanding the political economy of queer risk data, how it accrues value, and who benefits. Rather than analyzing data derived from the most at risk, I approach this arena through the concept of queer risk data to push against deficit-based approaches and push towards emancipatory methods. I have chosen this terminology to emphasize that, as Cal Byrock has observed, The standardized technologies of quantification that shift, mold, classify, and count those within the most at-risk category, such as MSM, are ontologically queer in their failure to fit people perfectly and in their susceptibility to be manipulated by those who might inhabit them. In what follows, I provide a framework for thinking about multiple kinds of value that emerge at the intersection of risk, data, and queer bodies in the context of HIV biomedical prevention. Then I track the construction of queer risk data across multiple stages of the research continuum, detailing who benefits from its production and highlighting the unexpected consequences and tangible harms of the circulation of these data through and across academic markets. I have worked in Peru for a bit over a decade on US-funded HIV biomedical prevention research focused on people categorized as MSM and trans prior to, throughout grad school, and now. Embedded in a team of physicians, epidemiologists, and study staff, I became deeply engaged in the implementation of day-to-day clinical trials. Since beginning this work, I have had multiple roles that have offered me a longitudinal 360-degree perspective on the tangible and intangible work necessary to do this research. As a research assistant, then analyst, and most recently holding a leadership position overseeing these studies, I have continually grappled with the tension between the desire to produce scientific knowledge and the challenges and at times harm created for the people who make these studies possible. So given the intertwined relationship between my professional trajectory and the ethnographic inquiry that became the focus of this study, it is difficult to determine when this research began. As such, my methodological approach is greatly informed by Michael Burroway's extended case study method. As stated, the extended case study method emulates a reflexive model of science that takes as its premise the intersubjectivity of scientists and the subject of study. Reflexive science valorizes intervention, process, structuration, and theory reconstruction. So while dates are somewhat fuzzy, this work, this ethnographic piece, started in fall 2016, and I embarked on 2 years of quote unquote formal ethnographic research, which included participant observations of clinical trials, in-depth interviews with scientists and people who participated as human subjects, and analyses of scientific publications and protocols. I will provide details of each of these 3 components broadly, but do want to note that the majority of the data presented today are primarily from interviews with Peruvian and American researchers and research participants. Okay, so document analysis focused on scientific publications, protocols, and recruitment media, so Facebook marketing, flyers, etc., and funding reports linked to the 3 HIV prevention studies I actively observed. Assessing various documents such as grant applications when folks were willing to share, ethics applications and consent forms, and regulatory documentation for PrEP importation, as well as the peer-reviewed literature, revealed insights about how most at-risk populations are being conceived of and also support biomedical approaches to health. This aspect of the inquiry closely examined the ways that value and data are described, both in terms of the importance of the scientific knowledge produced through these studies and the need for more biomedical research on people categorized as MSM and trans. Additionally, closely analyzing the Peruvian Ministry of Health guidelines and national strategic plans since 2000, I traced multiple trajectories in the development, regulation, and implementation of HIV prevention and care for gender and sexually diverse Peruvians. First, I documented the separation between the categories MSM and transgender women as 2 distinct populations both considered to be most at risk within the Peruvian HIV epidemic. And second, I focused on the various configurations of gender and sexually diverse people as risky and most at risk for HIV. In particular, the Peruvian National Guidelines for Transgender Health emerged as central to my document analysis. This policy guideline was based on a protocol for an HIV prevention and care biomedical study that provided cross-sex hormones for trans women to improve retention in HIV services. While initial drafts of this document circulated in and around 2016, it was not approved until 2017 and finally implemented in 2019. These diverse documents enabled me to map the ways that strategic classifications of MSM and transgender women are strategic and often contradictory sites in which to enact HIV industry agendas. Okay, so now into observations. So remember, this is part of the ethnographic toolkit. During my fieldwork, I actively observed 3 ongoing HIV prevention biomedical studies, 2 exclusively focused on trans women, and a third, although focused on MSM, also recruited trans women. My observations occurred in various settings, including but not limited to 4 separate clinics, numerous training sessions and recruitment events, all of which encompassed study participants, providers, study staff, and research scientists. I conducted observations to track the different meanings embedded within the doing of this research. As a member of the leadership team for these studies, I was well positioned to observe the politics and the behind-the-scenes practices necessary to make transnational clinical research practices work. This involved participation in weekly conference calls, in-person meetings, and mail correspondence. Observing research scientists presented opportunities to further understand the rationale behind the how of the studies, specifically how they're designed and how successes were assessed and valued. I compiled descriptive field notes throughout my observations, which were particularly useful when observing my close colleagues and mentors, as I sought to be reflexive about my unique position in these studies, both as an insider and as an outsider. In addition, I paid careful attention to the tensions that emerge between sex and gender categories as used in HIV science and how they were understood, contested, and at times resisted in daily research practices. This tension was often evident not in words, but through visual responses and sounds, such as groans, awkward laughs, and sighs. For example, during a street-based recruitment session, a field worker approached 2 potential research participants for a trans woman research study. Okay, so the field worker asks, "Are you interested in participating in a research study for trans women using the word mujeres trans?" One potential participant rolled her eyes and laughed and addressed her response both to the field worker and to her friend. "Me, yes, I'm trans, but not her, she's a travesti." Observations like this one were crucial to capture the playfulness that emerges in group settings and the strategic use of categories that is not readily conveyed in interviews. This example also highlights the hierarchical distinction between trans and travesti in daily life versus what can be accurately captured through standardized biomedical terminology and accompanying practices. In this interaction, we see several things occurring at once. One is a pushback on the recruiter's assumption that they are both trans. The second is the use of travesti as a slight dig, teasing among friends, which I noticed through several visual cues. Finally, by saying that she is trans, she implies that she can participate in the trial, while her friend, a travesti, a term closely associated with street-based sex work in Peru and with people with fewer economic resources, cannot participate. Although she's making a joke, she's also identifying important differences that inform a hierarchy of terms used to denote gender diversity. Yet in clinical research practice, both individuals were recruited as transgender, thus flattening these nuances. And finally, the third aspect of my methodological toolkit involved interviews. So between fall 2016 up to the end of 2018, I conducted a total of 110 in-depth interviews, 33 with research scientists, 17 with study staff, and 52 with people who were current participants or had previously participated as human subjects in HIV prevention research. I also had the opportunity to interview 3 US National Institutes of Health personnel that currently or previously oversaw US funded projects in Peru, and a past Gilead employee who had facilitated the donation of Truvada for IPREX, and 4 US medical students conducting global health research in Lima. My interviews with research scientists provided insights into the historical linkages between US and Peruvian investigators and the strategic processes and politics involved in the doing of transnational research. Furthermore, I asked key questions about training pathways and metrics for career advancement to better ascertain the meaning of value and data value. My conversations with NIH program officers and the former Gilead employee focus on the rationale for funding HIV prevention science in Peru versus, say, the United States, and the administrative processes to support this type of research. Conversations with study staff allowed me to detail the processes, skills, and tacit knowledge required to implement research, and importantly highlighted the challenges of aligning local gender and sexual diversity with biomedical expectations within the MSM and trans women categories that were being ascribed onto the studies. For example, in describing her experience assisting a participant fill out a survey, a nurse stated, "The participant told me she was trans and heterosexual, but only has sex with other men. So shouldn't I mark homosexual on the survey?" Such misunderstandings and confusions related to overlap between gender identity, sexuality, desire, and intimate practices were frequent and often became the focal point of study staff's frustrations and confusions regarding the difficulty of producing biomedical data. I was also incredibly privileged and had the opportunity to interview 37 people who were either actively participating or had participated in HIV prevention research. Through the support of study staff and peer recruiters with whom I'd had previous relationships, I conducted interview recruitment via convenient sampling methods. What was really interesting about the sampling methodology is towards the end of my ethnographic period, I started to get emails from folks saying, I've heard you were doing this. I have something to say on the subject. So recruitment, convenient sampling really worked in this context. So these interviews took place in a range of settings, including people's homes, street corners, private offices and clinics, activist organization, and even in cars. Conversations explored the lived experiences of participating in HIV prevention science and its impacts on the care they received. Also central were the meanings of the categories MSM and transgender, tensions that accompanied the use and application of these categories, and the influence of HIV science in constructing these categories, and the policing of the boundaries of membership within them. Okay. So thanks for staying with me through the methods. I did amplify the methods just because I know that they're of particular interest. So any other questions, I'd be happy to do so to answer them in the discussion or in the Q&A afterwards. So in what follows, I developed my argument in 3 parts. The first details the on-the-ground microeconomies evidencing the considerable human and material infrastructure needed to collect and capitalize on data extracted from people categorized as MSM and transgender women, those who were deemed most at risk for HIV. The second section draws attention to practices that mobilize queer risk data to accrue value that is leveraged as a form of scientific capital on the global HIV prevention research economy. Finally, the third section argues that the process of creating queer risk data flattens cultural and social context, obscuring the historical and social political drivers of HIV risk. Okay, so now to start with the first theme. In Lima in January 2018, while at different stages of the research process, there was at least 5 ongoing research studies actively recruiting people categorized as MSM and trans women. Jointly, the anticipated sample size across these studies was to recruit more than 1,500 people. The pressure to find participants manifests in particular ways and has spurred distinct microeconomies in the recruitment process that reflects how labor is valued within it. As described by Lorena, a peer recruiter, quote, "There's a lot of pressure to recruit participants quickly, but the investigators don't understand that recruitment is difficult, especially when so many travestis are already participating in research." An important and unique aspect of the creation of queer risk data is that data collection processes necessitate people of diverse genders and sexuality to perform multiple roles as recruiters and as participants. In this construction, peer recruiters are situated as a class of laborers separate from and hierarchically below salaried study staff, those who are clinically and scientifically trained and responsible for the implementation of biomedical components of the study protocol. Value is placed on knowledge of the local context and community structure. As a result, being a peer recruiter requires a skillful navigation of disparate spaces, clinic versus community, and constant negotiations between social boundaries, i.e. membership in community and membership over community for recruitment procedures. Staff who share commonalities with target populations across these studies are also deeply involved in the collecting of the right type of data that aligns with global health rubrics. For example, while observing a trans woman-run research recruitment and retention center, Maite, a peer recruiter and study staff, commented, quote, "Several of the travesti are coming in and don't understand the word transgender and don't identify as transgender. This has become a problem on the surveys since they are leaving this question blank. And Dr. Smith has emailed me twice now about missing data on the surveys." To this, the leader, Yasmin, responded, "Tell them that travesti is the same thing as transgender, and the surveys were written by gringos. Plus, if she wants to continue in the study, continue getting prep, and continue getting money, she needs to fill out the survey." This interaction demonstrates the process of introducing biomedical lexicon into community discourse and the politics implicated in creating data that reifies the categories themselves. Furthermore, this example highlights the uncomfortable tension within gringo-designed research that lacks contextual relevance, and as a result leads us to question not only the value of the data collected, but the coercive nature of the process itself. Evidence of the microeconomies surrounding data collection point to a larger human and material infrastructure built and carried out in Peru that enables macroeconomies to emerge. Most visibly, value is attributed to the data itself: blood, hair samples, and other biological material from human subjects deemed most at risk for HIV, as in risk data. Significantly, data on risk behaviors is also included in this category. Surveys, some of which take more than an hour to complete, capture intimate details about sexual desires and behaviors such as positioning, frequency, and condom use. In this way, the commodification of gender and sexual diverse identities operates as a mechanism to access specific kinds of bodies and associated risk data for the HIV marketplace. Moreover, I argue that the categories themselves have value. By claiming membership within and expertise on these communities, entrepreneurial opportunities emerge both for scientists and the people who are classified in this way. For example, manuscripts operate as the ultimate record keeper of a scholar's scientific reach, and they are essential to demonstrate expertise and acquire grants. Commodified identities are transformed into scientific capital. Publications are then valued and exchanged among scientists at a global level as currency and as a revenue-generating asset in the form of grants that indicate ownership and expertise. However, this pathway to establishing expertise is understood to primarily apply to scientists from the global north, namely the US in my context. and only of the most senior Peruvian collaborators. For example, Juancito, a Peruvian project coordinator with more than a decade of HIV research experience, a Peruvian medical degree, and a US master's degree in epidemiology, described, publications don't really help me keep my job. They would be good, but I will never be a leader of HIV research in Peru. That role is reserved for US investigators. This quote demonstrates that career advancement opportunities between Peruvian and American scholars and between Global North and Global South scholars are simply unequal. Juancito points to a critical aspect of how queer risk value is leveraged on a macro scale. The commodity in question, valued differently across markets, must be mobile to be traded and must travel to accrue scientific capital. The value is in arbitrage and comes from the ability to collect data in one location where it is cheaper and easier to do so, based on the availability of human capital and willing research subjects, and to move it to another market where it can be better leveraged. This concept is illustrated by a conversation I had with Dr. Dover, a US investigator with active research projects that simultaneously included sites in Peru, the US, and other global sites. He explained the benefits of doing research in Peru as follows. Without a doubt, it is harder to get funds to do international HIV research in Peru, say, versus sub-Saharan Africa, but there's a case to be made for Peru. Peru is a unique place to assess novel HIV prevention solutions among the most at-risk populations. The argument we always make in our NIH grant applications is that research in Peru is necessary to understand and better address the dynamics of a concentrated epidemic versus a generalized epidemic. Data from Peru is urgently needed to inform future studies and global prevention efforts to stop the spread of HIV. This research is not only important for understanding the Peruvian epidemic, but also the epidemic in the US. MSM and trans women are also at heightened risk for HIV in the US, but not the magnitude we see in Lima. As Dr. Dover's perspective illustrates, doing research on Peruvian MSM and trans women has value because of Global North funding and associated prestige. But what is more important is the economic potential of future work. Said differently, while participants and researchers in Peru do receive economic remuneration, the real value in collecting data from these at-risk populations, i.e. queer risk data, is in its extraction from Peru and circulation on the global HIV prevention marketplace. Dr. Dover's statement also points to the intertwined relationship between data and the commodification of gender and sexual identities. While he emphasizes that data from Peru is urgently needed, it is because Peru has a large number of the types of people who are understood to be the most at risk. Understandings of risk, ways to measure it, and its worth, and the broader political economy are bundled together. And thus data from MSM and trans women create and foster multiple forms of capital. The value accrued from these data occurs as a process, converting certain people who are categorized as most at risk into research subjects into human subjects, and finally human subjects into extracted risk data. In the local Peruvian context, knowledge economies surrounding clinical research constitutes a form of labor that accrues both material and effective value. However, it's in its circulation that these data from Peruvian human subjects, through transnational circuits of scientific knowledge, that they can be leveraged into revenue-generating assets. So it's not just data generated from the bioeconomy of blood and tissues that hold value. Rather, these data implicate gender and sexual identities through a unique framing of risk as linked to prevention, which are defined and utilized to market a particular kind of concentrated epidemic. In this bioeconomy, risky populations, namely MSM and trans women, are conceptualized in specific ways and leveraged according to those classifications. For example, While Peruvian scientists and activists have openly critiqued the limitations of the category MSM, they maintain its utility for research. The result is the dominance of the term across study design, protocols, and related instruments, irrespective of this controversy. Through observing biomedical prevention studies and analyzing their subsequent data, I have witnessed substantial ambiguity around what these categories mean and who is recruited within them. For example, Pedro, a Peruvian research coordinator and former peer recruiter, explained, obviously, when a researcher tells me that he wants to recruit MSM, he means gays, mosteceros, fletes, bisexuals, and until recently, also travesti. I recruit who I can and tell them I recruited MSM. What matters for the researchers is that they, MSM, attend the clinic for enrollment in study procedures. Pedro illustrates recruiting MSM as an active process that requires cultural reinterpretation to achieve the objective of creating a research population aligned with Global North rubrics. While people involved in fieldwork on the ground recognize the heterogeneity within the category, this reality is erased as diverse social identities are melded into one homogeneous social study population. This disconnect is important. If there is ambiguity and discrepancies about who's classified as MSM and/or transgender, what data is being captured? And what do these results even mean? Erasures are further illustrated in a conversation I had with Juan, a gay-identified Peruvian fieldworker. Juan stated, I recruit MSM, but I am not an MSM. I am gay and part of the gay community. In response, I questioned, so if MSM stands for men who have sex with men, are you saying that you are recruiting men who are having sex with other men, but do not necessarily identify as gay? Juan responded, no, it doesn't matter how they identify. I often recruit men who identify as gay and bisexual, as well as men who identify as MSM, or men who tell me that they are heterosexual. It is not about their identity, but their behavior. What matters is that they are at risk for HIV. Being at risk for HIV is why they are recruited to participate in these studies. As a follow-up, I asked, when you say at risk for HIV, what do you mean? Juan concluded, I mean that they have a lot of sex with other men. They are not using condoms. They don't have money for routine HIV tests or even condoms. And they are not talking to their partners about their risk. Not all gay men are MSM. MSM are the men who are sex workers and come from the poorest areas of Lima. They're the ones who do not know how one gets HIV or what to do if you have HIV. Studies are interested in MSM, not in people like me or my friends. As Juan notes, precarious employment, living in poverty, and having limited education and access to HIV care are key characteristics that not only put people at risk for HIV, but also the core attributes in defining MSM as a research category. Moreover, while transgender, unlike MSM, exists as a term beyond the scope of HIV research, it takes on particular meanings and associations within understandings of HIV risk. For example, Luz, a transgender peer promoter, said, I am trans, but I am not the trans who participate in these studies. I have a steady partner. I do not live a crazy life like other travesti on the street. They are the ones at risk for HIV. In this way, the complex realities related to social class and hierarchical structures of marginalization, factors that shape HIV vulnerability, are embedded within these biomedical identity categories. Although the conceptualizations of MSM and trans women remain unacknowledged, on the ground, it is clear that research efforts are focused on individuals experiencing heightened social suffering and economic marginalization. Even so, the Peruvian epidemic is not sold as being about endemic poverty, as are frequent characterizations of the HIV and AIDS epidemic in Africa. Rather, it is marketed as a concentrated epidemic that disproportionately affects people of diverse genders and sexualities. So I've presented a lot, but let's go through two broad SWOT summaries. So one is, by conducting an ethnography of data politics, I argue that explicit focus on data from people categorized as most at risk for HIV deeply implicates people of diverse genders and sexualities, and must be understood in relation to the political economy through which these data are produced and circulate. Further, manifold forms of value accrue through the research continuum, as they are leveraged by different data stakeholders, participants, recruiters, researchers, clinicians, epidemiologists, etc., and even policymakers. Through an analysis of the different value systems associated with queer risk data, this talk draws attention to the uncomfortable entanglement between people, health, and capitalism at the center of HIV prevention data. So this is important. The story of extractive data practices traded in a global political economy is not unique to the contemporary HIV industry, but rather a key element of transnational clinical research, which frequently leverages the global South as a living laboratory. The aim here is to unsettle from whom and where these data originate and how they circulate, to query beneficiaries of queer risk data production. From the creation and collection of Peruvian queer risk data to the statistical manipulations that are exported and circulated in primarily English language published articles and then leveraged for Global North grants, allows us to trace these inequities, those who profit and those who don't in this transnational academic marketplace, but also how important inequalities are hidden within the data. Social marginalization and economic instability are the structural inequalities that increase vulnerability to HIV. Yet these same factors also facilitate the recruitment of certain people into these studies, in which they are undervalued, underpaid, overworked, and only provided with temporary healthcare. Ironically, such labor mirrors the issues that contribute to their vulnerability to HIV acquisition. The Peruvian case study builds on our understanding of what Johanna Crane has named the valuable inequalities of global health, by detailing how, through the research continuum, the creation, mobilization, and capitalization of queer risk data generates and relies on inequalities. And this is the fundamental paradox, not only of biomedical prevention research, but of contemporary HIV science practices more broadly. Academic research begets more research, producing scientific knowledge as a global currency. This is true not only for Global North HIV scientists and Peruvian collaborators, but also for critical social scientists like me, who realize that the ability to secure funding and progress through the ranks of academic promotion depends on this transnational research economy fueled by queer risk data. On the ground, however, the result is a growing pool of people in need of HIV care who serve as a captive research population to sustain the HIV biomedical economy. The implications from this analysis extend beyond Peru and raise important questions relevant to other global sites where HIV prevention research is being offshored and conducted among marginalized and vulnerable communities. For example, what do we do with these data? Who benefits from the data, and who is responsible for addressing vulnerabilities to HIV? When thinking about social justice in contemporary PrEP science or HIV science, it is critical to underscore the entanglement with capitalism. As such, we must approach the arena of HIV data as a bioeconomy. As the Peruvian case study illustrates, queer risk data is leveraged to accrue scientific capital and traded across academic markets globally to fuel a growth industry around detailing risk and testing PrEP among people of diverse genders and sexualities in resource-limited settings. The process of creating and mobilizing queer risk data erases the structural dynamics associated with HIV vulnerability. Peru is not the first, nor will it be the last clinical research site in a resource-limited setting that advances global health agendas. Indeed, many countries in the global south are central to the approval and implementation of PrEP and its generic derivatives in the future. Yet the data politics and inequities at the center of HIV science are not part of the current discourse. And through this omission, the very real and very dire social location faced by many who participate in this research is not only erased, but replicated through the production and capitalization of queer risk data. Okay, thank you. With that, I look forward to continuing to think about these issues and engage with any questions and or comments that you may have.
Thank you very much, Amaya. That's an excellent presentation. I've just been scribbling down all kinds of notes, and I think, you know, your critical analysis of data is really pushing me and perhaps others in our thinking around the production of data, and really challenges us to be explicit, or at least more explicit, in how capitalism plays a role in this. And I thank you for that. Let's open it up to questions. You can either use the hand raise function or the chat, and I'll follow along. We've got a good half hour for discussion and questions. So let me just have a look here. Let's see. So in the chat, lots of excellent presentations. Does anybody have a question, or I'll go to the questions that are in the chat?
Polly, Joan has a hand up.
Oh, thanks. Joan, go ahead.
Am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay. Oh, that was so interesting, Amaya. Thank you. Really, I too was scribbling away at a million things. I really welcomed a fresh language for talking about things that have been threads through my own career since really early days of ethnography and qualitative research, trying to enter into the medical domain. And it took it, I remember one of the first formations of it was in response to survey data. I mean, the whole argument in the early days of qualitative as well, how could you do a survey? The way that data are collected, the way the questions are framed, the categories that you're given choices for are simply inadequate. And that was kind of an entry point for saying, for questioning data. But we didn't frame it the way you're framing it. And I love the way you've kind of updated and reframed and revitalized that question. And my question, I don't know if it's a question, but my urging to you is my more recent struggles in the last, 20 years or something have been in a more local manifestation of what you're talking about in the international, in the transnational kind of trade. And that's to do with the emergence of big data. And what is the place, how can a critical qualitative research encounter the big data argument, where it's so compelling, it's so invested in all the things that you're talking about, and it makes the same kind of omissions. I mean, they're collecting. I remember being invited to participate in a collection. They were starting a multi-year data collection thing that was going to solve you're going to trace everybody's health behavior and know exactly what was causing all these illnesses. And I mean, it was going to solve all the problems of the health sector. And did I have anything I could contribute to the construction of questions for these things that they were going to do for multiple years, and in getting all these people in with no thought of any of the things that they're talking about at all? So this is happening now. It's being swept along with all the big data push. And I'm wondering, I'm hoping that somebody like you will also be able to bring to bear your observations from this more global context into are more a Canadian ongoing scientific thing here as well, because it's happening at so many different levels. So I just want to say bravo for kind of injecting new life into this. And I can see where I want you to go and lots of places for you to go. So well done.
Thank you. On the big data, I mean, just to be totally frank, this is a thing I'm struggling with. Like, how do you get into the modeling? And there's really, for those on the call who are interested in the big data pivot, I mean, Ruha Benjamin is the person to go to, and the beautiful work that's being done by Dr. Benjamin. But if this is an active thing that I'm thinking about. So if the big data push is part of interest for folks on the call and I did not cover it, I'm happy to share my reading list with those folks as well.
Thanks, Amaya. I see there's a question from Carlos.
Hello, thank you so much, Amaya, for your presentation. It was wonderful to hear about your project. I was very interested in learning more about some of the power relationships that emerge when data is being planned and produced. And so I was wondering, I think your work is very important in all types of research, reflecting critically about how our work reproduces and perpetuates power relationships. And I was wondering, how did you go about navigating also the power relationships that are involved in doing these works? So for example, in working on this critical project with your colleagues, with your mentors, especially when you were a graduate student or just at the beginning stages of getting a faculty position. If you could comment on that, that would be very, very interesting to me. And also a second point that is more of a comment. I was also wondering about if there were maybe some community organizations doing work. What could be some sort of popular data, and how that data can be similar or different to scientific data, and maybe also exploring what popular data is could also give us some answers about how to do better our own jobs. Thank you so much, Amaya.
Oh, good comments. The first one's really hard. I wish we were at the end of class, at the end of time, so I could be like, oh, let's talk about this later. I am still very, very much navigating these power relations. I see the wonderful Safito on the call, who we have the pleasure of working together, and Zaf has witnessed some of these ongoing power struggles that we have on these calls. So I do not have an answer. It is one of these things that it's part of our world, and I am slowly but surely trying to develop those methods and kind of the muscle memory to deal with the power imbalances. But with regards to this work that's presented here, I was very clear from the outset. One of my big critiques of global health ethnographers is that they are not part of the process. So they go in, they make some really rough critiques, and then they pull out. I couldn't. These were the people who trained me and who had been my, essentially professional family for a decade. And it is a struggle. So I was very intentional in my analysis, and as I'm working through these products, to always have a gut check, both with community, who often tells me I don't go far enough, and with my mentors, who are the PIs of these huge NIH grants. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but my intention is not to point fingers and walk away, but rather to get people to buy in and to be like, oh shit, like our survey's bad. Like what do you mean the context, like the Peruvian context doesn't separate sexual orientation from gender identity? Now what do we do? So this presentation has multiple forms, right? That are a bit more palatable in different contexts. So knowing that I was in a critical space, I went hard on the critical science and wanted to connect it to theory. But I do a variation of this talk that's very much intended for physician epidemiologists. And then I shape it somewhat differently. Like I talk about study instruments, I talk about different levers of power that different people in different positions can take up. So that's the power relation. Sorry, I'm going long-winded, but the second part of your question was with regards to community organization and community epi. I'm mixed on this. I have seen it. So I work with two community organizations that are amazing. And the trans organization, Feminist, that I work with just did a community census of trans folks in Peru. And this was not funded by health research, and it was remarkable. However, what then happened is identifying themselves as a powerhouse for research has meant that now they are being approached by the researchers to do their research. And we can't ignore the differences in like economic stability. So of course they're going to take on this pathway. So I don't know. I don't know the answer with how to involve community meaningfully without taking away from the solidarity efforts. There is a tradition in Latin America for field epi. Jaime Braille does beautiful work talking about field epidemiologists. But given scant resources after the 2008 economic crash and like what global health is, I'm not sure. Like I haven't seen it. I haven't yet seen it done well. And so if you have examples of that or anyone does, I would love to learn about that.
Thank you, Amaya. I see you mentioned Zafiro, and they've got their hand up right now. So let's go there. And then I will go to the chat after that.
Thank you. Hi, Amaya. Thank you so much for the presentation. And I just wanted to share that this thing that was important for me, that you said that the importance of pushing, because last year I submitted a paper to a clinical journal, and it was a paper around a randomized clinical trial on MSM in Mexico. And one of the exclusions criteria that I put in the paper was that we didn't, the exclusion criteria was transsexual, transgender, or travesti. So when I got comments back from the journal, they were saying that these terms were pejorative and that I shouldn't use them. And I was like, for me, it was like, well, in the context that I'm using it and in the country that I'm using it, they're not pejorative, but we are referring to particular gender diversity that I want to be noted. But then I was like, I started thinking about the target of the journal, the people who are reviewing the journal, and what should I do? Should I just take it down and just follow their advice and what they were asking in order for me to publish, or just push and tell them why it is important for this to be in the paper? So thank you, because I didn't know what to do, and I was still thinking about it, and I feel this type of talks are so important for like people who are in global health to know why certain things are important and how and where to keep pushing and how to do it. So thank you.
Thanks for that.
Thank you. Catherine, I see you've got your hand up. If you wouldn't mind, I'll just ask a question from the chat first, and then we'll go to you. So Amaya, this is from Max Stewart, who, first of all, thanks you for the presentation. I was wondering if you could talk about the ways that studies make sure to affirm trans women, transvest gender identities while framing their risk as similar to MSM, and if there's the same conceptualization around non-binary identities.
I was just reading the second part. Okay. Good question. I think that there is very good work being done with this, especially in Canada and in the US with non-binary and gender non-conforming youth, because we've learned very quickly that these categories don't work. And so I think I would push you towards that literature. In my particular case study, because of hegemonic knowledge translation, the work that I'm doing, the work that I'm seeing done in Peru really doesn't take up needs of non-binary Peruvians. It's a huge limitation. Our first trans masculine study was done a year and a half ago. So it's all pretty new. That's not to say that outside of the health domain, there isn't phenomenal scholarship. In fact, there's two incredible anthropologists out of San Marcos. Their names escape me right now, but they just published a book in Spanish discussing non-binary gender formation in the Peruvian context. So there's work, just not exactly in my arena. I know that you're interested in the risk framing as similar to MSM. Because of IPREX in the Peruvian context, it's not similar, it's the exact same because of, I guess because of biology, I don't know, because of however it was initially conceptualized, and it's just kind of continued to snowball out of control from there. There is beginning to be recognition about risk differences and some discussion with regards to vulnerabilities, but this is relatively new. So it's very much an area that's in need of pushing and exploration.
Thanks, Amaya. Okay, Catherine.
Hi, Maya. Thank you so much. That was really, really very interesting. I was reflecting on Carlos's question and your response to that in terms of, you know, sort of what the potential options can look like. And I've read Dana Lear's response in the chat as well. And you know, I think that there have been attempts. I worked with, you know, a very much kind of community-based, not epidemiology group, but sort of, you know, community-focused research organization that was interested in making sure that data being collected about gay men in the UK was by and for primarily gay men in the UK in relation to HIV. So Sigma Research, you know, ran for a long time. I worked with them for 16 years. And in that time, the stigma that we faced as an organization, being regarded as quasi-academic and not really good enough. We didn't publish in journals. We published for the community, with the community. We developed all questions in consultation led by community, so that this issue that you're talking about kind of conceptual translation, you know, was not an issue. And yet, you know, all organizations operate in that knowledge economy that you were reflecting on, and it, you know, so then you try and make a shift and you know, do things differently, but that, you know, this just reflects Dana's response really. And what I find really fascinating at the moment in the UK context is we have so many community organizations, and I've heard this from other locations as well across the global health spectrum, organizations that used to be focused around kind of community output research findings that were sensible and interpretable by community members. Now we see this trend for wanting the outputs to be journal articles, because there's a recognition that comes with that, and potential powers, but that's not true in all contexts, as you said from one of your quotes. And I find that so fascinating that also turns on its head because of the very power dynamic that people are trying to overturn by having things participatory and community based. So it's just a fascinating circumstance that that we operate within, and we have to keep challenging. But the knowledge hierarchy is what it is, isn't it?
Yeah, it is what it is, and not, you know, I'm very cognizant that, you know, there's lots of students on this call, and I want you to be like excited and, you know, invigorated by the work, but we all are very much part of this system. And so I think part of this for me as well is the transparency that comes with talking about these challenges, right? Like, I mean, I'll be the first to say, like, I am deeply implicated in these harsh critiques that I'm bringing to light. And so I need help in figuring out like what the next steps are. And that's part of the reason why I do these talks.
Thanks, Amaya. Here's a question from Sarah O'Sullivan in the chat, if you want to have a look at it. Can you speak about how HIV prevention science itself reifies HIV as a problem? You have deviant behavior, you're nodding. Also kind of interesting to think about your thoughts of the intersection between queer risk data and race.
Ooh,
Just a
yes,
couple
for
of
that last question. So for the first question, there is so much literature on the question of deviance and risk. And I mean, Kane Race has done a beautiful job writing about it in ways that are much more eloquent than what I could do now. So I would point you more in that direction. The short answer is yes, and even more so. Risk and prevention has gone to whole new heights with therapeutic prevention strategies. To the last question, this is something that I've been really thinking about, especially now with the new emphasis on quotas for Black MSM, Black trans women, and like it makes me cringe when I hear about quotas in the big trials, and yet I take a step back and go, okay, but what's the better? Like we want to be inclusive of data, we want this data, but the quotas are so problematic. So I know it's not quite the question, but it is something that I'm very much thinking about. In my particular context with race, one of the big things that's missing is questions of indigeneity. And we know that there's a lot of within country migration, especially now around COVID, just like mass migration from the highlands. Now in Peru, South America is experiencing mass migration from Venezuela. It's the second largest migration phenomenon in the world after Syria. And Peru is one of the main host countries. And so in the past 5 years with the communities I work with, all of a sudden we're seeing tremendous xenophobia against Venezuelan trans women. And this also brings with it questions of eroticism, sexuality, beauty markets, the way people verbalize and perform desire. It's completely changed the world in which I do my analysis. So thank you for that question. I don't have an answer, and it's one that I'm actively puzzling with, is how do we talk about race in this context? I can say one thing though, it is very different than the way that we conceptualize race in Canada or in the US, very, very different. And that is part of my, I don't want to say slowness, maybe I'll say thoughtfulness, because I've been slow to take on race, but I pause, like I don't quite know how to understand the concept of race shedding my own training in the US and my own physical location in Canada. Like it's hard for me to think about it without being there and speaking with scholars about this.
Thank you, Maya. Always we end these things with more questions than answers, so we're right on point here. I just noticed that Izumi Sakamoto, who's one of our CQ fellows, asked a question. She's curious to find out how your Western US-based colleagues respond to your research. Would you mind commenting on that?
Yeah, hi. Medium, some better than others. It works much better when I am not last minute and I, thoughtfully engage them in the process, as everyone does, with this. I have had several places where I've gotten significant pushback. This presentation has been seen by actually all of the PIs on the study that I have observed. With medium responses, a lot of times the responses are, we can't be everywhere in every place, so more ownership needs to be given to in-country investigators, which is true, but there's very, very strong structural barriers that limit that, and money being one of them. The other thing, so presentations have gone pretty well. Writings have been trickier. And so we just had a paper come out called The Wisdom of Mistrust, and it's specifically on trans women who participated in these trials and refused to participate in and dropped out. And that paper was a bit of a labor of love to get out because it implicated us as the researchers in our lack of trustworthiness. And so that paper took several revisions. It is out. The version that it's out in, I'm glad it's out in the world. It's not as strong as I would have hoped. So that's to say that it's not always, unicorns and rainbows in terms of like these relationships. And I'm working towards it. And, you know, to Carlos's point earlier, my relationship with this team has changed over 10 years from being an RA to an analyst and now being on the teams. And so I'm also flexing those muscles, like what it means to say no, to say like, I hear you, I respect you, but I disagree with you. And I'm hoping that this next stage of my career, right, like as I start to settle into being an assistant professor, I will be able to leverage that now a bit more.
Nice. If I could ask Ren Gould, who's got quite a bit of juicy questions and comments going there. Ren, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself if that's possible, and maybe we can open it up a bit to questions and comments and also a bit more of a discussion, if that's possible.
Sure. Hi. So I think part of the reason I was so happy to put things in the chat is because I have a certain amount of stage fright. But broadly, it just sort of seemed like some of the ethnographic data you were collecting seemed to indicate that kind of global North identity formations were being broadly conflated with being of higher socioeconomic status, having access to wealth, etc. Since it's like, oh, well, if you're gay, well, that means that you're not a survival sex worker. It means that you have this kind of access. And kind of in my head, I began to wonder, well, does gay also just mean something else entirely? Since when there was some discussion of understanding gender identity as really distinct from sexual orientation, my immediate thinking was that that's a cleavage that doesn't necessarily need to be reflected in global South communities. And so I was also wondering if gay even encompassed that in some ways. And ultimately, I just kind of wondered, at least for the people who are kind of recipients of sort of the teardown, people who are assigned lower socioeconomic status, who are engaged in probably survival sex work. Is there evidence of them objecting to that treatment? So when you have someone saying, oh, that person is just travesti, is there like a look of like, what did you just say? Or like, oh my God, I'm going to destroy you, or even like a hostile comment? Is there even something more organized, like the recognition that wow, these people all think they're so great, but all they have is just more money. So even more like a class consciousness. And I was just kind of curious about what you had observed.
Yeah, you're touching on a very important topic, which is the heterogeneity within these categories, and also this class dynamics, which my presentation was weak on. One of the important things to note is they're playful, right? Like they're leveraged in different contexts to mean different things. And so the example I gave, it was very much in a playful, among friends, teasing, pejorative, but teasing. One thing that your comment didn't make me think of is the word gay is used in Spanish as gay, and queer now evermore is being used, but it does come with it a bit more hierarchical prominence because it reflects back to English speaking. So in my work now, I'm paying particular attention to those participants that evoke certain language and not others. One quick thing is we have to note the context of these HIV biomedical trials. We don't want, I mean, as the quotes indicated, they're not looking to recruit quote unquote low risk individuals, mainly because of risk factors. To test therapeutic prevention, you need risk to show effect, right? So it's like the dirty underbelly of clinical trials. You want a high risk population. And that's oftentimes why they're being offshored, is because in contexts like Peru, PrEP is not available. So you are able to test PrEP and its modalities in a treatment naive community. All of this is incredibly oppressive and politically laden, the fact that these communities still do not have access to these technologies. So it was meant to touch on class, but class and hierarchies also on a global scale.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Amaya. I see lots of head nodding. And also Ren, thank you for the question and comments. Really appreciate that. I'm just noticing the time here. What an engaging and lively conversation and beautiful questions that I think will stay with us for a long time. I would just want to take this time to thank Amaya for her really wonderful, thoughtful, critical, methodological, theoretical presentation that she was challenged with, and just for rising to that, and really, really appreciate that. Just a couple of announcements. We hope that you can join us for our next CQ seminar presentation with Dr. Ruth Rodney, which will be on December the 8th. And also that if you haven't already registered for the 3rd biannual CQ Critical Pedagogies Symposium on Teaching and Learning, it will happen on November 5th from 11 to 2. And this year's theme is Metamorphosis and Practice, Pandemic Learning Lessons. So that's it for us. Thank you again, Amaya. Lots of information in the chat and some people who would love to follow up with you afterwards. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you all.